So, Michelle, once again, thank you so much for joining me. For folks who tuned in, my name is Johnny Perez. I work as director of youth prison programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And this month, I wanted to have a number of conversations, talking to a lot of different people from around the country, getting their thoughts on faith, race, and justice. And the first person that I thought about immediately came to mind was Michelle Jones Daniel, and I'm glad, so happy that you were able to join me. So I want to, before we get into it, I want to go ahead and read your bio, and then get some thoughts from you. How are you feeling this afternoon?
I'm good. I'm really pleased and honored to be invited to this conversation. I think it's important and critical at this time in particular, and so I'm really honored to be here.
Nice, thanks. So Michelle Jones Daniel is a third-year doctoral student in the American Studies program in New York University. She's interested in excavating the collateral consequences of criminal convictions of people and families directly impacted by mass incarceration, in addition to participating in a scholarly project challenging the narratives of history of women's prison with a group of incarcerated scholars. While incarcerated, Michelle published and presented her research findings to dispel notions about the reach and intellectual capacity of justice-involved women. Michelle's advocacy extends beyond the classroom through collaborations and opportunities to speak truth to power. While incarcerated, she presented a legislative testimony on a reentry alternative she created for long-term incarcerated people that was approved by the Indiana State Interim Committee on the Criminal Code and has joined the advisory boards of the Lumina Foundation and the Urban Institute. You have like such an extensive background, and I'm gonna stop there, Michelle. In preparation for this call, we had a general conversation about the current climate, the current political climate, the current health climate, and at NRCAT we work with people who are directly impacted. Like such much of your research and work has focused on, and also faith leaders, and a lot of times people ask me why faith leaders, and one of the main reasons is that like faith leaders are able to hold our legislators morally accountable to the values that they say they stand on, or at least run for at the moment, and then we can hold them accountable later. But there's also, a certain power with communities of faith when they get organized, and the power that they can have in keeping, I guess, the social balance, if you will. So I guess the first question that I have for you is, like recently, many people of faith were appalled by this president's use of St. John's Episcopal, one of St. John's Episcopal Domination Church as a backdrop for a picture, right? Especially after calling a military crackdown on protesters at the moment, and many of whom have protested, were protesting peacefully as a result of the death of, the brother George Floyd. So thinking about this nation's history, Michelle, and the separation between this church and, between church and state, like when you saw, like the picture of him, our president taking a picture in front of the church, like what were some of your reactions and some of your thoughts that came to mind as you witnessed that, like along with many others around the country? What were some of your reactions to that image?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think he was holding up something completely disconnected from his beliefs. I felt like he was holding truly a prop. It could have been a turkey leg. It could have been a cane, in terms of its objectivity and its total disconnection to him in the way in which he presents himself. Now, of course, there are people who disagree with that. I mean, you think about the white evangelicals who believe that Trump was a fulfillment of a prophecy with Israel. They believe that his arrival marked a spiritual revolution and revival for them, right? I think we need to pay attention to this moment and recognize that up until 2016, there was some sort of a reconciliation between some churches where many Black members began to attend white churches, and you saw a spattering of white people attending predominantly Black churches, but that seems to significantly shift after 2016. And speaking more directly to that, there was a New York Times article not too long ago that went into this conversation in particular, and it highlighted the white church members' leadership and their willingness to accuse Black worshipers of being divisive when they expressed their concern about Trayvon Martin and what churches' response should be to this endemic and disavowal of Black suffering. White churches came out with like a cookie-cutter response that they should keep their eyes on the kingdom, and that the church was colorblind, that the talk of racial justice was divisive and not a matter of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, it flies in the face of what the gospel really is about. I mean, Jesus was a disruptor of the status quo. Jesus was a man who turned over the money changers' tables at the temple. He was the person who went against the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right, of what religion was supposed to be at that time. And so I feel like, at this time, I've been like greatly inspired by some African American ministers who, instead of taking the stance that, Monday through Saturday, you deal with all the horror and the suffering of Black people, and on Sunday you come to church and act like it's just the gospel. There are Black preachers like Reverend Otis Moss and Reverend David at Abyssinian Christian Church in Colorado, and my husband, Reverend Darrell Daniel, who are calling out the white church and their complete blindness and their indifference to racism, prejudice, and carceral capitalism. So I saw it as a mockery of what the gospel is supposed to be. The gospel is revolutionary. The gospel disrupts the status quo. It's supposed to be moving us to this idea that we should be transformed by a renewing of our mind. Well, if you are getting a renewal of the mind and you want to have a mind like Jesus had a mind of love, not just for people who look like him in the pews and the people who attend their church and the people who are on the side of Trump, right? So yeah, that's how I feel.
What do you think is the dangerousness, of connecting or making these, I guess, connecting messages that are not, like messages that folks have literally interpreted and seen as being hate fueled, and that has fueled, racism in this country, and even in some cases violence and even anti-Muslim bigotry, what do you think are the dangerousness between connecting, faith per se with this kind of destructive rhetoric, if you will?
Well, it weakens the power to call out larger systems to respond to a moral righteousness. You degrade the fabric of the ability to call people in check morally and righteously when you allow faith and God and scripture and beliefs to become wrapped up in the rhetoric of a political orientation. We lose that. And what happens is that our young people overwhelmingly become disillusioned with the church. So they're leaving in droves because they can't see their efforts, their ministry, their drives, their desires reflected there. And so what you see today is like a mass exodus, right? And the church has declined in membership in some places over the century, over the last few decades. And it's because they don't see themselves, they don't see the world reflected across the pulpit. So it's like being morally bankrupt.
I had a conversation with some youth leaders yesterday, and one of the questions that I asked them was exactly how can the church center their leadership. And one of the challenges they mentioned was that they often feel, left out for a number of reasons, including just not being able to know how to plug in or not feeling heard and valued inside of those spaces. I found it very powerful to hear that from them.
And I think that's right. I think that's right. That article that I keep referencing in the New York Times, one pastor said, we didn't talk, I'm quoting, we didn't talk about it much before because we didn't know, he said, of whites generally in a recent interview at one of Gateway's satellite campuses. He said, we just thought, okay, there was a tremendous racial problems in America. The civil rights movement came, laws have been passed now, and we're over that now. We passed it. What has happened in the last few years is many white pastors are beginning to realize we never dealt with this scripturally. We never truly repented. And I thought that was really powerful. And, in that moment for him and other faith leaders, white faith leaders, to kind of come to the carpet. And as you see in the Black church, there of those preachers who are willing to speak out on this and not treat Sunday as some sort of utopian experience and not deal with the realities that affect Black lives Monday through Saturday, they call this out regularly. They've been doing this for decades. And so it's nothing new to them, but they see it as this is a moment in which we can choose to do something new. We can choose to do something different. And it's an exciting time in that regard. But what's interesting is that we have to be careful, because when certain preachers go across the pulpit and say, hey, we need to reckon with these things, and that the way we reckon with these things is to vote. I mean, in this article, they came back, the same preacher came back later and said that they need to get involved, but later passed out leaflets that led congregants to believe that the best candidate to meet the needs of the people right now was Trump. And so we have to be careful, right? There is a political education that must happen, and there must be a reckoning.
I like your thinking around that. There needs to be a political education that needs to happen. And my reaction to that is like, who needs to be doing the educating? You know, I'll tell you, you know, right after the protests, or you know, not now, not even right after, like they're still going, right? It's happening right now as we talk. You know, and there were people who reached out for guidance on how to, you know, do exactly what you're talking about, you know, and you know, had different to decide whether, you know, like you know, a political education needs to happen, and then whose burden of responsibility is it to do that teaching? You know, getting your thoughts and reactions to that.
Yeah, I think it's the responsibility of the people who are leading hundreds of people as congregants. It is their responsibility to educate themselves. It is their responsibility, because all of the material is available. It's been here. It's widely available. It's not up to Black people to educate them on the moral bankruptcy that has occurred in this country. They know it. They can educate. Most of them are avid readers. They can educate themselves and then educate their congregation. Is my personal viewpoint on it.
Thank you, Michelle. So in response to the BLM protests, right, the Attorney General Barr ordered the entire federal system on the national lockdown. And so the USA Today recently reported that it's been the most severe restrictions in 25 years. And you know, we know much of that looks like solitary confinement. You know, in fact, there's an upcoming report from the Unlock the Box campaign that notes that there's been an increase of over 500% you know, in isolation, and how corrections Italy has responded to not only the current protests and uprisings, but you know, people who were already on lockdown as a result of COVID, or at least what they call a modified lockdown as a result of COVID. So, and we know the mental, emotional, and irreversible damage that solitary confinement, you know, imposes on people. So, Michelle, I guess what I want to ask is, like, when you think about state-sponsored violence, you know, we often think about violence as a case of police brutality, which is very real, and I don't want to minimize it in any way. But given what we know, right, do we need to expand our definition of what it actually means? You know, what violence actually means, and if so, you know, like, how does this violence per se, like reach into our different areas of society.
Right, right. So I definitely agree that we need to expand our idea of what state-sponsored or state-sanctioned violence looks like. It is not always physical in that sense. I mean, there are sociologists and other folks developing this idea of carceral trauma. And carceral trauma is coming from the experiences of living in a captive space inside prisons and living in the captive space of communities and hyper surveillance and hyper policing. There is a psychic and emotional and physical cost that Black and brown bodies incur as a result of dealing with the police and dealing with policing and racial profiling and racialized law enforcement practices. There's a psychic, emotional, and spiritual cost. There's reports that discuss how Black women who are in these communities who are suffering at that level are more likely to suffer from diabetes and be obese and suffer from PTSD. And so the cost is bigger than just the physical, which is huge. The actual physical violence is huge, but I think we do need to expand the idea of state-sponsored violence to include this idea of carceral trauma. And to that point, there is a young woman by the name of Shauna Vaughn, who is part of an organization, and I'm going to pull it up really quick. But she developed this idea of PTPD, post-traumatic prison disorder. And what she's getting at, what she's trying to educate us about is that there is a cost. There is a cost to the body, the spirit, and the mind as a result of enduring incarceration and being captive in communities. She helped define the ways that the disorder is separate and unique from other trauma disorders, and that there is a need for a separate diagnostic category and separate forms of treatment, right? And so what she did was she conducted all of these surveys, and she discovered how PTPD negatively affects the majority of people who have experienced the carceral system, particularly people who have served lengthy prison sentences. And that's, her name is Shauna Vaughn, and the organization she works with is called Silent Cry. And I think that is how we need to expand the idea of state-sanctioned violence that is not always viewed on the body, but is inside the spirit, inside the psychic bubble of the human being that shows up in physical early premature death, that shows up in sicknesses and illnesses and diabetes and obesity, and it shows up in infant mortality. That is what's at the heart of state-sanctioned violence as well.
Do you think that prison sentences would be as harsh as they are if judges had this information or thought about violence or thought about how incarceration impacts people in such a way? We talk, we tend to think in terms of like, hey, like when you're done with the time, like that's it, and then there's all of these other consequences that are also an extension of the sentence that I think some of us are still trying to figure out in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, the problem is that yes, it could change the action of judges, but the system as a whole
we still have,
is oriented towards racism, is oriented towards stereotyping people of color. It's oriented towards, as Reverend Otis Moss talked about, looking at any child, any Black girl as 10 years older than they really are. It's oriented, and meaning that they should be more adult than they actually are. It's oriented towards looking at Black and brown bodies as criminal bodies. So while I think this would change the minds of some judges who are oriented towards justice and have some political education that makes them understand these systems that are at work, because the system is founded on these kind of very pillared principles and ideals, the work will still be tremendous. tremendous to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's often, you know, even now with the conversations around policing on exactly what are the asks, you know, are we asking for reforming, you know, for reform asks, or are we asking for asks that's going to bring us closer to, you know, to abolition, and being intentional about those things. And I try to keep that in mind as an organizer, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Michelle, a lot of so some of your work has included a scholarly project, right, challenging the narratives of the history of women's prison with a group of incarcerated scholars, and I appreciated that as a person who, you know, discovered the power of education while incarcerated, and I've met
Yeah.
scholars who don't have PhDs, right, but they have multiple, you know, PhDs, except that they don't, you know, have I guess the societal recognition to
The
say that.
credence, the piece of paper. Yeah.
Yeah. So I appreciated that, you know, when I first like heard about this work, I'm like, wow, it's just, you know, be able to working with, you know, these incarcerated scholars, I identify with that, right? And then that also included, you know, being able to publish and present your research findings, dispelling notions, right, about the reach and intellectual capacity of justice involved women. So that sticks out to me for a lot of different reasons. You know, of course, you know, like the intellectual capacity, right? Like one, how are folks in general who have been incarcerated, both men and women who have been incarcerated, about what their view about their intellectual capacity is. And then if you could pull back the layers and then speak specifically to the intellectual capacity, or the you know, the dispelling of those notions within justice involved women. Like why is this important to talk about in preserving the history?
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you also for the shout out for the level and the work that we're doing. I mean, I find it critically important, and not just because we're dispelling the notion that the idea that an incarcerated person is less capable of doing intellectual scholarly work, that is less capable of doing ethnography, that's less capable of analyzing primary and secondary source data simply because they are behind walls. I think that this project alone does that and more, because I push this idea then I don't need to tell you that I'm into that we have the intellectual capacity. What I want you to do now is I'm pushing you further then to then epistemically privilege the experience of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated scholars as a way in which to look, as a lens in which to look at the archive. Because through our own experience, our lens as having being incarcerated in captive bodies, we looked at the same archive and found amazing things that had not been recorded in the in Indiana history at all.
Well, can you give some examples?
You know, there were certain things. Yeah, for example, a prison was created for women who were fallen, ruined, women who were on the outside of well-to-do society. A prison was created just for them to reform their criminal nature because they were fallen. Okay, because they were once incarcerated in a prison with men, and women were raped. The women were made to run in the grounds of the prison naked. Guards were charged $10 a month to have open, free access to the women's department. So a group of Quaker women got together to remove these women and create their own prison, right? So that they could reform them. And so the idea that a woman had to be captive for reform, okay, as opposed to providing things in the community, in the social fabric of the community to support those people. They said, we have to incarcerate you to help you. And this prison actually incarcerated girls as young as 5 and up, because they were reforming their deviant nature, right? And so so you have a system that is set up to punish the women violently, gendered and sexualized violence of these women inside. You create another system in which to then also do gendered and sexualized violence upon them in the facility. Women were ducked, which means their heads were put in sinks and then dunked until they could barely hardly breathe. They were locked in closets. They were beaten while naked and hosed down, under the idea that they were being reformed under Christian ideals, that they were morally incapable of living in the world without this correction. And so this project is important because it's that foundation of the reform movement that is still at work in prisons, in women's prisons today, where the number one thing that they police in prisons is sexuality.
Yeah.
Not black market, not hardcore violence. No, it's all sexuality. And just as those girls were ducked and they were beaten for masturbation and they were locked in closets on bread and water diets, girls are locked in solitary confinement and left there and losing time cuts and losing access to vocational programming and their children, all because they may be gender nonconforming, or they may have a relationship with a woman in prison. So why we did this project is to show the red threads through time, the criminalization of sexuality, the sexual and gender violence that started with the idea of reform. Mm-hmm. This is why I appreciate Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's point that we need to be fighting for non-reformist reforms, which are reforms that are designed to change the structures of these systems and how these systems operate as a whole, and to ultimately dismantle them, right, as opposed to tweaking. Indeed. And the criminal justice system has been decades of tweaking, right? So that's, in a nutshell, that's why we're doing this project, so that we can use the lens of the 19th century to have conversations about today. Because in prison, we were not allowed to do a contemporary project, resurvey any of our women inside to figure out what was happening with them today. We had to use the 19th century to have a conversation about today.
That's interesting.
Which ended up being tremendously fruitful, because we showed the red threads that have happened since 1873 that are still present in the modern penitentiary today.
No, it's funny you mentioned that about having to look into the past to better understand the present and even look into the future. I found myself making some personal calls to people that I knew or that I know, were alive around the civil rights era, and just talking to them, and just say, hey, like, tell me about those times and how did y'all handle this? And and just kind of like feeling the need actually to get closer to them to better understand the current moment. So I really appreciate, that.
I think it's important to look back, right? Yeah. Because some lessons have already come to fruition. Yeah. And what we have done is we have chosen to ignore them. And we've chosen not to pass that wisdom down. And the dominant narrative in this country.
There's so much pain.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But also the dominant narrative is crafted by people who are not us. So books and textbooks and things that are designed for consumption at the grade school, high school, undergrad level don't get to the depth of these stories.
Yeah. That's another important part. When I was incarcerated, I read A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Have you read it?
I way back. I couldn't even quote anything from it now. No.
So it's a really short book, and it's Viktor Frankl's experience during World War II, Nazi Germany, and how he saw society change, and and just like it's like literally like probably 90 pages as you remember, but and he talked about the importance of the educational system, and how that helped shape views for people once they were like literally like in society. And I'm paraphrasing here. It's been a while since I read it, but as you talk,
but it's true
because it gets at.
So this is why the book is important.
Can you say that again?
I'm sorry, but that's exactly why the book. That's why the book is important, because the book offers a counter narrative to the dominant narrative that is the story told, right? And the more we do that, the more we counter these narratives with what Foucault calls the subjugated knowledges of the people, right? the more we can turn the corner on what people will consume as the quote unquote truth of anything, right?
Yeah.
We need to complicate the dominant narrative with the counter. We need to do it all the time, all the time. So in other words, while memoirs and biographies and autobiographies are written by the quote unquote great people, right? And other historians come in and write the story about the organization. For example, I sat and talked with other scholars who write about the same people that we're writing about, who write about people who were in charge of Magdalene laundries and asylums. And they have historically ignored the reports of the patients, the reports of the girls, the reports of the women, the reports of the boys. They have, consistently, historically, overall, the majority, have not taken them as truth. So then here we come as scholars attending American Historical Association conferences and American Studies Association conferences, and we are privileging the stories and the narratives of the people, right? Suddenly we are like, oh man, we just didn't take those complaints as true, right? And that's why we need to do that, because now we're changing the minds of the people who have the power to write the textbooks. We're putting in position to tell the stories and write those histories. And it's critical because the next generation is going to need to know what we are doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And usually history is told through the eyes of the victor, not the
Absolutely. Yeah, that dominant narrative is rarely crafted by the people. But that's why I think, and I'm not savvy at it, that I want to get savvy at it, is the beauty in Instagram and the beauty in some of these other social media platforms, is because the people are sharing the story in a major way. I just want to, I wonder how we archive these mighty stories for posterity. That's my next question for the world.
Nice. Hence the importance. So I got two more questions for you, so I'm not going to hold you long. In the last few weeks, we've been exposed to an increase of hurt and pain, as in the recent events. And, I think it's hurt on top of hurt and pain on top of pain, especially for, people of color in this country where, we're just getting over one thing, trying to deal with a national pandemic, trying to fill with news that you're more likely to die than everyone else during this pandemic, and add that to the list of other stats, and then seeing, to your point about social media, it's that gift and a curse where, that it's amplified, our voices and reach. It's also exposed us to some harmful stuff, and I've seen content online that's just like, I just have to shut this off. And on the heels of Amy Cooper pointing the finger at I forget the brother's name in Central Park, but wrongfully accusing him and saying, hey, I'm going to call the cops on you and say, you're an African American and who's harassing me. The killing of George Floyd, it's like there's increased hurt and pain on a national level. I would say like this increased hurt of pain and things like that, and not only for the Black community, although disproportionately so, but I want to say it's been like really literally hurting people of all races. I've seen folks who are not Black folks come out and like really feeling hurt and pain as a result, because this is so divisive, right? Like you're either it is, racism should be divisive, right? Like you're for or against it, there is no middle ground, or sometimes, and that's my personal opinion, but one thing that I've been asking in the last few weeks is just asking people, like, how do we heal from this moment moving forward? And if that is even possible, given everything that we know about our history and this country's history and things like that, how do we heal from here? Because I think it's good to feel the pain and the hurt, and we have to, because it motivates us and it does a number of things. Right? But also there has, and again, I'm not a clinician saying this, and this is my own personal experience, but there has to come a time when we we take a look at that same hurt and pain, you know, and do something with it, you know,
Right.
and heal. And that looks different for everyone. So, you know, by all means, I'm not saying that one blanket fits all, but you know, as a
Right.
nation, how do we deal with the hurt and pain, and how do we heal from this moment?
Right. I think there has to be an honest reckoning, an honest conversations across the board at all levels, and an honest calling out of the truth. We can't no longer abide by the elephant in the room. Clearly, this country is over that, right? That we go to church and we go to our communities and we go to work and we act like that everything is perfect and that all things are well when things are not all well. So there must be a clearing of the chest and the heart. I mean, I know I'm sure you're married. I'm sure you've heard people say that you and your wife should never go to bed angry, right? Because that is disruptive to the relationship, to the marriage. Okay. Similarly, we can't allow the anger to go without being heard and reckoned with, right?
Yeah.
But I have a personal belief that there's like no stagnation in God. My husband preached a sermon the other day that God does new. And he talked about the way we have eaten the cookie of the cookie cutter Christianity that is served same over and over and over in Sunday. And we think that's how God operates. Well, one of his main things is that God is always doing new. He doesn't do normal. He's always urging us to be our best selves, right? So if anyone is in Christ, the scripture says, old things pass away and all things become new. So we're talking about we can no longer stay in the same activities and thinking and think that we are standing and moving with God. We are continuously needing to reimagine our world anew, and that's why I look to our creative people. All of us are creative, but particularly our creative people, because they can help push us forward, because we can't stand still and continue to do things as we've always done. So one of the things is I think about is like, what's my practice, right? I struggle doing my meditation. And so I said, okay, one of the things I need to do is make that a commitment. I struggled to get back on working out because of COVID. I said, okay, I'm going to make that a commitment. I struggled with not having time with a therapist. But because I felt like my mental health was important and of value to me, I got with a therapist. And I'm working through my anger by taking care of my temple. And but that doesn't mean I then don't get back to work. It's time to shake things up and do new. We can't stay where we are. We can't allow racism and socioeconomic disenfranchisement of people of color to continue to stagnate and rot and stench in this country, and smell in this country, and rot away in our communities as it has. Right? So I say be ready for the new, for the creative, for things to come out the box that we've never done before. We don't have to do things the way we've always done them, and that should be the starting point if we're really going to turn the corner when we're looking at dismantling structural racism and social and economic disenfranchisement of people of color. We have to be willing to say, crap we did before does not work. And let's do something new. And I'm excited about it. I'm excited about some of the amazing things I've already started to hear, and people getting together and thinking about how to defund the police, and thinking about how to bolster community resources so that people of color and communities get what they need, right? I'm excited about people who are starting to have these conversations in a mighty way. And I'm very proud of our Black political leaders who are saying this is my job to do, who are not sitting around waiting for somebody else to sanction their movement. They are asserting their power, and I'm proud of them.
Yeah. I was super proud to see Melissa Harris and Cory Booker really argue on the Senate floor about into the bill and not like, hey, like this can't happen. You know, really, really powerful to see that. You know, and I mean, you know, I think as Black people, we feel a responsibility to need to speak up. You know, um,
Yeah.
you know, and then you know, and I've also met some, you know, Black leaders who say, hey, Johnny, like you've been here before. You know, call me when something changes, or not necessarily call me when something changes, but before I'd be surprised, like, you know, like call me after the protests are done, that like that kind of thing, you know, uh, and not, you know, not
Wow.
blemish content. It's like, hey, like, you know, we've protested before and continue to, and I do think that there's a need to protest. I think there's something specific that is said when you take your physical body out and you put it out there and say, no, I do not stand for this. You know, and then at the same time, there's, you know, folks who've been like marching for years who now say, wow, like, you know, here
Yeah.
another time, and I'm almost fatigued and stuff. But the change, I think I've seen enough. I think I've seen some changes that do make me hopeful and allow me to share in your optimism, you know, and not, and I mean, there's some
Yeah.
cosmetic things, like, for example, you know, like NASCAR, you know, banning the Confederate flag, and, you know, other institutions have banned statues and things like that, you know, and yesterday I talked about the relationship, well, actually I asked the panelists the relationship between policy change and cultural change, you know, the
Hmm.
relationship between the two, you know, which one is most likely to influence the other, you know, and I think there was a consensus around the culture change precedes
Yes.
policy, you know.
I was going to absolutely say that.
What are your
I
some
would
thoughts?
absolutely say that.
What are your thoughts about that? Can you react?
Okay, so social consequences. I'll go. I'll stick with the area that I'm most competent in. Social consequences of criminal convictions are multi and varied, and most of them have no law to back them up. What is underneath social consequences of criminal convictions are the legal. It's part of the tier. It's
Mm-hmm.
part of the tier of ways in which communities can be affected. The other part of that is culture. For example, and I talk about this to other people all the time, you can have a desire to go get a dog, be formerly incarcerated. Can't get that dog because you have to check a box to say that you're formerly incarcerated. Well, there's no rule in the world that says you can't have a dog from a rescue shelter. But the consequences are social. And the problem with that is, and so social culture is the driving, it drives the law, right? And drives legislation. So that's why I said there are certain aspects of this that have me hopeful, because seems to be a bit more of a cultural shift than we've experienced before. I mean, I think about the protests at Ferguson, and I think about, you know, Eric Garner's protests in the streets. Those were primarily Black faces. But the protests that we've been seeing of late, and I'm from Indiana, every time the news is on, I see a lot of white faces. And
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, there was a protest held in Whitestown, Indiana,
Wow.
okay, for Black Lives Matter. And so those kinds of things that are happening make me go, huh,
Yeah.
maybe we're entering a space of culture shift. But I am not naive at all, right? Because we as a people in this country have been praying and protesting, resisting and fighting forever.
Mm-hmm.
Since we've been here, right? We have been a body of people who have struggled from the moment we got on these shores. And we are not over that. We're not through that yet. But I think that movements like the ones that you're leading and ones that are led by a lot of formerly incarcerated people in this movement that you and I know of, who are leading the charge, who are getting access to funds to run their organizations and to do direct services work, who are integrating and working with universities, who are working with postdocs and undergrads, who are teaching. All of us are a part of this educating and political shift that's happening, because we are entering into spaces and doing work that was impossible to get done a decade ago, right? And I think that that's also evidence. And I think that so people like you, Jenny, who have been at this, and you are at the top tier of people who have access to resources and resources and are engaging with people, axes of power, but who are also doing a lot of work, direct action on the ground. You are are an example of what's impossible now. That and the more of us who get in those positions to achieve this kind of work, the more we'll be able to be a part of the cultural shift, because they'll say, oh, how many formerly incarcerated people who you know who's in charge of an organization that is doing da-da-da-da-da-da? How many Black educators who are formerly incarcerated? How many business owners? And as we grow in numbers, we're also going to be a part of this shift. And I think I see it happening. I mean, people are doing things now that I sat in prison 10 years ago, not imagining it be possible right now.
You know, it's funny you say that. I think I recognized, a while back that it's important for us to create new statistics in a sense, right? When
Yes.
when when I see my fellow person who's been incarcerated and achieved their a doctoral degree, or they create a successful company, or just reach any level of success, I'm happy, because their success is also my success, and it's proof that we are
Absolutely.
more than
Absolutely.
what people say that we are, which is really important and integral. And with that, we also understanding the responsibility in that role. So at NRCAT, we've committed to building the capacity of people who've been impacted by solitary. We're working with different state campaigns to build out their coalitions and including family members. So it's not just folks who've been impacted, but also their family members who've had to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think about the work of Ebony Underwood, fighting as a child of incarcerated parent. I mean, things are happening that just were not happening a decade ago. Yeah.
Well, Michelle, look, I know that you're in the car and we can talk forever, but before I let you go, I am going to ask you, how can people support you and your vision and the work that you're doing? You can take some time to really flesh that out for us. We are recording this. We will make this available afterwards and blast it out to our networks beyond just the people that called in. But it's important that, we hear from you. How can people support you, your vision, the work that you're doing, and anything else you want to mention?
Sure. So thank you, Johnny, for that. Appreciate it. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I am board chair of Constructing Our Future, which is a nonprofit organization that was created by formerly incarcerated women inside. The goal of that organization is to provide safe, healthy, transitional housing for formerly incarcerated women, and then help them with their transition to a career, be it in construction or be it through educational opportunities. That's what we are. That's what we do. We've been really, really blessed this year to obtain funding to get our first house, and we're really excited about it. We're going to become part of the Safe Housing Network that was started by Susan Burton and A New Way of Life. Yes, we are also working, I'm really proud of that. And right now we're currently working with our community investment fund in Indianapolis, who granted us money to do direct cash assistance and bill pay to formerly incarcerated women who are suffering as a result of COVID-19. And we're about to launch that next week so that the women can fill out a survey and we can get cash directly to them to help them in this time. So we are moving forward with Constructing Our Future, something that we sat in a prison and thought up and worked out and put the great need of housing with the need to support formerly incarcerated women. And so that's an effort that's ongoing, and people who are interested to talk to me more about that, my email is michelle@constructingourfuture.org, all one word. And I'm happy to dialogue with them about that, because we are working now to start a campaign to bring awareness to the fact that at the Indiana Women's Prison and other prisons, the warden and the deputy warden are looking to keep the women in solitary confinement in their cells, the whole facility, because everyone went on lockdown as a result of COVID-19. And they're looking to maintain that, keeping them one officer on a housing unit, 1 to 2 on a housing unit with a door locked most of the day behind a locked door. And you know if that's a fire hazard. If there was a fire, one human being would not be able to unlock all the doors to get those women out of those cells in the event of a fire to safety in time, right? Lives are threatened. It is the summer. It is extremely hot in Indianapolis. And so the fact that these women would have to be largely locked down all the time, we've been receiving the emails, we've been receiving the cries, we've been receiving all of that, and we're mobilizing now to do something about it. And one of the things that we're asking people to do is to tweet at Governor Holcomb and email Governor Holcomb and explain to him that it is not okay to leave people in solitary confinement type living when they have done nothing wrong, and it's a threat to health, safety, and soul. So
I'm glad you said that. That's my current. I mean, we worked like a dog to get an emergency plan together to provide a way in which the governor, we asked him to release people before COVID-19 infected facilities, and he ignored that. He ignored our first letter that we sent out March 5th. And now people are using the reality of COVID to maintain a near solitary or solitary-like living conditions experience for people. And it has to not stand. It's got to stop. So we'll totally connect offline since we're almost up to time. But I'll tell you, and for folks, who will be watching this, that's exactly has been, NRCAT strategy as a result of COVID-19. We've been, employing governors to do three things, right? To ensure that correctional facilities do not use solitary confinement as a containment strategy for COVID-19, which we know and are seeing continue to happen. Right. There's also a concern about creating this new normal, which you're talking about, where now, it's, it took years to get us here. And now in 6 months, we can't reverse what's taking years to get here.
We're reversing, right. And some of the cells that are meant to only hold 2 people hold 3, and in some of them 4. So imagine that, all crammed in this little space and on almost permanent lockdown. I mean, they're letting people out to go to the bathroom, and they're circulating people out to use the phone, and they're circulating people out to use the microwave, but they're going back into a locked cell. They're not, you know what I mean? And they're using the idea that they're using COVID as a reason, as a mask for allowing this to happen. When they could simply give women masks and allow them to socially distance. Right? Without locking them down. I mean, I have to go to the grocery store. You have to go to the store. You have to go to places where people are. The governor in our state is on phase 4. We're opening up our state on phase 4, which means people can gather into groups of 250. Well, if you can gather in a group of 250, I'm sure you can handle 20 people in a day room.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
We should totally connect, because I think that we'd be interested in finding ways to support you.
I definitely want to talk to you about it. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll send you follow people around that. And that's the beauty of these conversations where we're spreading awareness, but we're also actually doing the work, and that is I think something we can help. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so Michelle, thank you so much. For people watching, we'll send a follow-up email with Michelle's direct information, her bio, and ways to contact her directly. In the event that.
Absolutely, I would love to dialogue with anybody who is interested in connecting with what we're doing in Indianapolis. I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere. We're not New York, and we're not LA. We're in the Midwest. But Indiana needs a lot of work too. Yeah. Needs support too.
That's right. So Michelle, thank you so much. I'll talk to you later. Please try to enjoy the weekend. And again, thank you so much for still making time to do on this call. I really appreciate it.
No problem. I love you, Johnny, and I appreciate all of your hard work, and I thank you for inviting me. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Talk soon. Later.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.